So today we're pleased to special seminar on Special and Starkman, who is a professor of physics and astronomy at Case Western Reserve University, director for the Institute for the Science of Origins, and director of the Center for Education and Research in Cosmology and Astrophysics, if the website is up to date. Mentioned Glenn is a citizen. So his work involved the search for evidence of non-trivial topology of the universe in the CMB, modified theories of gravity, large-scale correlations of the universe, and other aspects of theoretical cosmology, particle physics, and astrophysics. Glenn's talk today is either statistical anisotropy or non-Gaussianity or information to believe what I've on the screen. So yeah, take it away, Glenn.
Great.
They also want us to question. They also want us to question during. So I don't know if we have a firm time limit here. It's more about when you want for lunch.
Hours. So when I emailed days, I had a days and talk. Sure. The thing is, I have to. I don't have time to change my talk that I gave Drid a few weeks ago. Is that okay? And he said yes. So I should tell you a little bit of a preface to that talk. It was at a conference on primordial non-Gaussianity, which is kind of strange because I've never worked on primordial non-Gaussianity. And I wasn't really there originally to go to the conference, although I was very happy to go to much of it and talk in it. I was really there to work with Yashar Akrami, who was just transitioning from being a postdoc at Case Western to being a faculty member at the Institute for Theoretical Physics in Madrid. But that's okay. So the nice thing was everyone in the audience worked on primordial non-Gaussianity. So I could have a message that was focused on primordial non-Gaussianity. I suspect not everyone here works on primordial non-Gaussianity, but that's okay because the talk isn't really about primordial non-Gaussianity. At one level, it's about our anisotropic universe. At another level, it's about the importance of understanding the predictions of our model that are kind of get baked in without us ever, looking at them, and how they get baked in such a way that we all of our statistical inferences assume them, and how that presents a certain risk in what we do that we should be aware of. I mean, we're not mathematicians. We don't stand up at the beginning of our lecture and say, I'm going to assume the axiom of choice, or this depends on the Riemann hypothesis. But we have to have in mind the assumptions we're making. So with that preface, let me launch into this talk about our anisotropic universe. And this is work that I've been doing with lots and lots of people over many, many years. Really, some of it kind of starting from those days when I was a postdoc here. And the group of us working on it now even decided to give ourselves a name, compact collaboration, because Yashar thought that was a useful thing to do. And since he is the junior faculty member based in Europe, and he seemed to think that would be very helpful to him, we said, sure, let's go. Let's call ourselves the compact collaboration, because a lot of our work is about compact universe. But you can see lots of names here that range from senior faculty members to a whole bunch of graduate students that are just starting out, like Kevin, postdocs like Dayan, more grad students, Johannes. Most of these people aren't about to enter the market, so I don't have to remind you that you want to hire them. But you might want to collaborate with some of them, and then some people whose collaborations date back over the last 20 years to some of the various aspects. So this is not the universe you think it is, and it's not the universe you were told it should be, and that's my basic message. And so let me explain. And I'll start my explanation back over 50 years ago with this picture that probably many of you have seen of the telescope that was able to make a beautiful map of the cosmic microwave background that had no features in it, but it was not yet the featurelessness of it that was interesting so much as the fact that they could measure a temperature and pretty much isotropic over the entire sky of about 3 degrees K. It was a long time before we were really able to start making maps in which we saw the underlying cosmological fluctuations in that map that we knew had to be there. So Kobe made eventually a map like this, that the Cosmic Background Explorer made a map like this, in which, of course, the most prominent feature is the galaxy across the middle, but in which you see all sorts of fluctuations that you should be extremely excited about. Certainly, those of us who were around to see it at the time were extremely excited about it because it meant we were going to be able to start understanding the universe using the cosmic microwave background. I'm skipping all of the fantastic work that was done from the ground and from balloons, not because it wasn't important and fantastic, but because what I'm going to talk about is most easily seen in full sky maps. Okay? So the next full sky map was made by the Wilkinson microwave anisotropy probe. You'll notice that there's no galactic foreground here, not because they managed to send the satellite out of the galaxy. Maybe one day we'll do that, but because you're able to combine different wave bands in order to get a map that is approximately, at least to the best of your abilities, consists entirely of cosmic microwave background and not foreground. Now, the original version of this map, interestingly, came with a disclaimer that said, "Do not use this for research." Now, people thought it was the press map. Actually, the map was developed for research. It was developed to look for the topology of the universe, which is part of a large part of the motivation of how I got into this, and something that other people in the room, like Dick, was very interested and has been interested in over the years. But nevertheless, this is what we think the microwave sky looks like. Even better maps made more recently in the last, I think I can say 10 years. Yeah, I guess their most recent map is just a few years old, and people are still trying to improve those maps by the Planck team of the European Space Agency, as well as people here in the US and around the world. Okay. So we have these fantastic maps of the microwave sky, and I'm showing you temperature maps, but of course we also have polarization maps. What are we supposed to do with them? Well, if you've been to cosmology kindergarten, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to expand them in spherical harmonics. So, and what we're interested in is the coefficients of those spherical harmonics. Why is that? It's because our model for those fluctuations tells us that those coefficients of the spherical harmonics, the ALMs, are independent Gaussian, or in the crowd I was talking to, nearly Gaussian random variables of zero mean. And the sky is statistically isotropic. The universe is statistically isotropic. So the expectation value of any product of pair of ALMs is 0 unless they share the same L and they share the same M, in which case it is some number C sub L, the angular power spectrum, which depends only on L. Okay? And that is an expression of the statistical isotropy. And then almost, well, I used to say all, but I'm standing in an audience of people interested in non-Gaussianity, but almost all the interesting information is going to be in the C sub L's. What we're trying to find is the C sub L's, because that's what the theory predicts. That's what you're trying to find out. And approximately that is the average value of the ALM squareds for fixed L. And so what you're trying to get at is that C sub L. And this idea is incredibly successful. So here are angular power spectra for temperature and E-mode polarization and cross power spectrum. And with 7 parameters, we can fit to complicated curves to far more than 7 points. And we are astonished, or we should be astonished, both by the experimental accomplishment and by the remarkable agreement with theory. Now, I have a little phrase there at the end, especially for statistics that the theory prefers. Okay? What do I mean? Well, I've shown you plots of C sub L's because that's what the theory told me was interesting, but we haven't yet asked about other predictions the theory makes, other statistics that we could build that aren't just the C sub L's. Okay? So there's a but here. And one of the big buts is the question, well, is it accurate that the expectation value of pairs of ALMs is 0 unless L equals L prime and M equals M prime, and that then that product, when it isn't 0, is only L dependent? Shouldn't we check? Shouldn't we check that the sky is actually statistically isotropic, that it supports the statistical isotropy of our model, of our theory? Now, that's not built into that check isn't built into your likelihood function, because your likelihood function says, let's take the C sub L's that we predict and see how the ALMs of the sky, match that predicted curves, and they match it awfully well. We can discuss how well. Is the chi-squared of the fit good enough? Blah blah blah. But you look at it, you say you got something right. But what about this incredibly important prediction that's going to underlie all sorts of other work that we do? In particular, if you're working on primordial non-Gaussianity, are we going to be able to extract the information about primordial non-Gaussianity if the product of ALMs isn't diagonal, if the 3-point function isn't 0, if the 4-point function isn't just isn't nearly the what you would get from a statistically isotropic sky? Okay, so we'll come back to that question a little bit later, but I think the first hint that the answer to the question we're trying to ask, is the universe statistically isotropic, was from something called the low L anomaly, which is nonsense. I mean, it is what at least got me excited. It is, but it's the fact that you see this point. This is the quadrupole. These are the cosmic variance error bars on the quadrupole. And for some reason, people were excited about the fact that the quadrupole was well outside the cosmic variance error bars. Okay? But if you're a frequentist, you ask, well, how outside? And the p-value of that is about 0.1. And there's enough points here that p-values of 0.1 shouldn't bother you. After all, there are other points here that are also well off the curve. And you might ask about them. They're interesting, actually. They turned out to be connected to this whole story, but I'm not going to talk about it unless someone asks me. They're not that central to the story. So what's more interesting is not thinking about this in terms of its L-space representation, but thinking about in terms of its angular representation. So instead of thinking about the angular power spectrum, let's dial back the clock to the before cosmologists were teaching CMB people what to measure, and look at something called the angular correlation function, which is what they would have thought was the more interesting thing. So you take two directions on the sky, you take the product of the temperatures in those two directions separated by an angle theta, and you average over all such pairs of points that are separated by that angle. Okay. And that's the angular correlation function. But the thing is, you might say, well, why would you be interested in that? It's the same, it contains exactly the same information as the angular power spectrum, just differently organized. Right? Just deal with the angular power spectrum. We understand the statistics of it. Those are independent variables because they're just sums of squares of Gaussian variables. Or we can understand all the statistical distribution of that. So don't bother. Okay. Now, that's kind of the same attitude as saying, well, when you get a time series, don't Fourier transform it. Sometimes you get new information from doing such transforms. So maybe we should look at the angular power spectrum, and people did. So here are some plots from way back in the Kobe days of the angular correlation function. So here it is from the clearest plot I could find is from the 4-year map with 4-year Kobe DMR results. It's hard to see what's odd about this, if anything is. I will have you notice that they seem to be quite close to 0 up above 60 degrees. This didn't escape people's attention. We'll see in a minute how if you characterize the fact that they're close to 0, you start to get worried. But people certainly were wondering about it. Here's a paper by Yipen Jing and Feng Li Zhe about trying to explain that. So people knew back in the Kobe days that there was something very odd about the fact that the angular correlation function was 0 at large angles. So here, I think, is maybe the clearest plot we've made or other people have made of. So I keep showing it even though it's very, very old. So this is from WMAP, so a long time ago, in the aughts, okay, from their 3-year release, and it's showing, first of all, what the theoretical prediction is for the best fit lambda CDM model. That's the dashed line. You see this huge blue band around it. Those are the cosmic variance error bars. Don't get fooled by them. And I mean, what I mean by that is we're used to looking at things like the angular power spectrum where the C sub L's are independent variables, right? There's supposed to be no covariance between them. And so that means that I can look at the error bars around each one and interpret them and say, oh, if I'm outside of this, then I can get a kind of chi squared by I or something. You can't do that here because there's correlation. C of theta, different thetas are highly correlated, okay? You can notice that all of these curves look nothing like this curve. Okay? It's irrelevant. Okay? It's not the fact that these curves don't agree with this curve that is unusual. If you wrote down a statistic that compared these curves to this curve and asked how unusual is it that they differ by this much, you'll again come up with some number like, oh, it happens about 10% of the time. Okay? What is strange about most of these curves is how close they are to 0 from about 60 degrees up. Okay? Now, you might see that there's kind of 2 classes of curves. There's these curves that are very close to 0. Those are the Q band, the V band, the W band observations of WMAP. Okay, in the part of the sky that they trusted, namely outside of a certain galactic cut, the KP0 mask, and the independent linear combinations map, which is the one I showed you, which reconstructs the full sky, okay, over that region. So we take the measurements, okay, and we look at whether they have angular correlations in the part of the sky we trust, and we find they don't. But when we go and take the reported C sub L's and turn them into an angular correlation function, or when we take the full sky version of that map, not just the part of it outside the galaxy, we get a little bit more correlation than we do here. So somehow when we've gone from the observations to the theoretically inferred quantities, we've ended up with something that has more correlations at large angles. Okay. Now, people looking at this finally constructed a statistic. Okay? No one had constructed, as far as I could tell, a statistic to ask, is the absence of large angle correlation statistics? And so back at the beginning of WMAP, they constructed a statistic. Here it is. S1/2, the integral from -1 to half, or if you like, from 60 degrees to 180 degrees of C of theta squared d cos theta. Well, so how small is that? Well, our theory tells us that that number should be something like 50,000 micro k to the 4th. If we look at the full sky in something like the ILC, we'll get some number like 8,000 to 9,000, which is lower than that by a lot, but we haven't plotted the distribution of that number. It's somewhere at the, it happens, that's at about the 5th percentile. Okay. But if we take the part of the sky outside a pretty much any reasonable galactic mass, we find that it's more like 1,000. And that turns out to be about a p-value of about 3 × 10⁻⁴. Now, those numbers, here I'm showing you the 5th year WMAP values. Those numbers have been remarkably stable from map to map, from satellite to satellite. We might have hoped in going from WMAP to Planck that this would go away. Okay, and I'll show you in a minute what happens. Now, it turns out that what little correlations there are comes mostly from pairs of points on the sky in which at least one of them is inside this KQ75 mass. Okay. So here's the black is the full sky angular correlation function, and the blue is the part of it in which at least one of the points is inside the part of the sky that you least trust. And the red is what you get outside the map. All right. Did this change in Planck? Clearly, the answer is no. Nothing changed at all. Go look at the SMICA map, or this was the WMAP ILC 9 year. Both of them, you have exactly the same thing going on. And here is listing what it is in a bunch of those 2018 Planck maps. Okay, so the number is remarkably stable. No matter what methodology you use for cleaning up, taking out the foregrounds. So somewhere depending on the map, exact map you use, somewhere between 0.03 and about 0.1% of realizations of the concordance model of inflationary lambda CDM have that little cut sky large angle correlation. Okay. It's actually a little bit worse than that, and we're working to characterize how much worse. Because most of those, there are 2 ways that you can imagine getting a low angular correlation. One is have all the low LC sub L's be close to 0. That's not how the sky does it, right? The sky doesn't have all the low LC sub L's close to 0. C2 is a little bit low, but the others are pretty close to what they're supposed to be. And most of these random realizations that have so little cut, have so less than half, do it in the way that the sky doesn't. So this is a violation of the assumption of Gaussian random statistically isotropic, or of the prediction of Gaussian random statistically isotropic ALMs. Even if we replaced all the theoretical C sub L's by their measured value up to L of 20, cosmic variance would still give us only a 3% chance of recovering so little S1/2 in a particular realization. And most of those would be much poorer fits to that theory than the current data. In other words, they would get it by having all the low LC sub L's be 0. And that's because what's actually going on in the on the sky is not that these have all been suppressed. It's that the contribution of these cancel each other. C sub L of 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. In fact, C sub 2 is almost perfectly tuned to calculate to cancel to the extent it can the contributions of C3, 4, 5, and 6 to C of theta, or at least to S1/2. All right, so how do we explain that? Here's some explanations. Didn't that just go away? No. I never believe in a posteriori statistics. Well, that's a reasonable thing to say. You should always go check. When you discover that there is a sheep floating in the clouds, you don't necessarily believe that there are sheep floating in the clouds. You go back and look later to see if there's still sheep floating in the clouds. You start discovering, no, now there's elephants or or cotton balls or whatever. Okay. Now the thing is, unfortunately, people didn't write down the S1/2 statistic back in the Kobe days. If they had, then we would have learned that the condition that the p-value got about a factor of 200 worse going from Kobe to WMAP. In other words, Kobe had very big error bars on the value of S1/2. It was low, it would have been low, but it would have had very large error bars, and it would have been about a 5% problem, if you call a 5% problem. And that went from 5% down to a few times 10 to the minus 4. Okay, cosmic variance. I never believe in anything less than some number, depending on exactly what subfield of physics you come. Explanation number 4, inflation can do that. And here's the thing, certainly single field inflation can't do that. You have to get, it's really hard, you cannot just change P of K. That will not do this, right? Because of cosmic variance. All that is equivalent to saying, let me change the C sub L's of the theory to be exactly what I want them to be to make the expected C of theta 0. But just because the expected C of theta is 0 doesn't mean that you go out and measure C of theta 0, because there's a lot of cosmic variance at low L. So the other possibility is that there is new physics that correlates the C sub L's. So for example, so this could be a statistical fluke, but if it's not a fluke, it's probably the probable implication is that the YLMs times radial functions are the wrong basis for preserving Gaussianity. Because if you want to preserve Gaussianity as a good approximation to the statistics of some underlying modes, these are not the modes. So what's an example of that? Well, for example, if the universe has non-trivial cosmic topology, then that induces correlations between the YLMs. Can go into a long explanation of that. But basically, look at a cube and notice that a cube isn't rotationally invariant. In fact, the cube is one of the most symmetric of all the possibilities if you have non-trivial topology. So you automatically violate statistical isometry. Now, there are many things beyond the C sub L, many ways of looking at the data beyond the C sub Ls, and I'd like to look at just a couple of them to convince you that this isn't just an issue about the lack of large angle correlation. And I'm just going to pick a few of them out, not because those are the most important ones, that they're just the most important ones to me. So alignments. You might ask, and we did a long time ago, what directions are associated with the Lth multiple in the sky? Well, if I'm interested in the dipole of the CMB, I probably wouldn't come and tell you what the A1Ms are, right? I would tell you what direction the dipole points, and I would tell you what its amplitude is. Why would I do that? Well, because this unit vector is a unit vector, and this A is a scalar under rotations. And so they give us a way of understanding what's going on and having a physical interpretation. Now, you can ask, can I do the same thing at higher L's? And the answer is yes. I can think of the sum over M of ALM, YLM. So I've summed away the M information and have a function on the sky that has angular momentum L as the product of L dipoles. Okay, and it turns out I probably want to subtract all the. So this is if a product of L dipoles, product of L angular momentum 1 objects is an angular momentum L object plus an angular momentum L minus 2 object and an L minus 4 object and L minus 6 object, etc. So let me get rid of all those lower angular momentum L's, and that means I can represent, instead of 2L plus 1 ALMs, I can have L unit vectors and an overall magnitude. Okay. And those L unit vectors are in fact vectors in terms of how they transform. The A is a scalar, and only the A depends on C sub L. So the information that we're used to that we're told is important, lives in the A's, and the information in these directions isn't supposed to be interesting. Now, it turns out we thought we had come up with this. We thought we were very happy. We thought this was very clever. It turns out that there was this other fellow, you might have heard of him, who this is how he actually wrote down information on the sphere. His name was Maxwell. Well, he used it in this not very well-known book on which much of modern physics relies. So, and it hasn't been completely forgotten. This method of this representation of information on the sphere is used by geometrologists, for example. I haven't met too many geometrologists, so maybe that's why we hadn't heard of it. Anyway, we were excited to learn that we had merely reproduced in a much less elegant way the work of Maxwell. All right. So the quadrupole then has two vectors. We can think of it as a plane. The octopole has three vectors. We can think of it as three planes. And if we look at the directions of those planes on the sky, here is another very old graph. And we promised ourselves we would, the group of us, that we would keep presenting in this ridiculous projection so that no one accused us of changing things up. So we've been doing that for quite a while, and I have some dots on here and some lines. This is the microwave sky. This dark gray is the direction that of the normal to the quadrupole plane. Okay, and I put it both in the north and the south, but kind of forget the north because things wrap around in a funny way. It's easier to see things in the south. And then there are the three planes of the octopole. Now, what you should notice is that they're all sitting there on a very small part of the sky. Right? And in fact, the quadrupole is sitting pretty much at the center of the three octopole planes. So these four planes, instead of being randomly oriented on the sky, are pretty much parallel to one another. Now, they're also parallel. Yep.
It's like a headless vector in a sense.
Yes.
So
it's also up there.
exactly.
And it's just
But with,
inconvenient to think of
but
it
with
because it's
the odds, then there is a preferred direction. Dipole.
So I
So
suppose
there's a symmetry breaking associated with the odds that isn't there for the evens,
that's true.
which is probably interesting.
Well, it's interesting because it's certainly connected to the mirror parity
Yeah, exactly.
problem, right? We would see that in the mirror parity, that presumably maybe the odds all point the same. I actually don't know whether the odds. That's a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question.
Yeah, whether they all point the same direction.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Yeah. So you see that they're all here. There's all sorts of other things that I put in the sky that make you wonder whether this is actually important, because they're sitting on the ecliptic, the plane of the solar system. I don't think any of us would think that the solar system has anything to do with cosmology, except maybe from an anthropic point of view. They're also sitting close to the dipole, which is the direction of our motion through the universe, we think, which is kind of odd. And they're not so far from the equinox, which is even less. It seems less interesting as a cosmological point of view. So you might wonder which of these things is am I just supposed to say, oh, this is some nonsense that's coming from solar system foregrounds? It's really hard for that to be the case. So first of all, this has a p-value of about 0.1 to 0.6. Very, very small. What I should have said is, I actually took out the slide, is that what we actually see is a ring of extrema perpendicular to the solar system. Right? So that's that. No one has been able to find any solar system explanation for the quadrupole octopole planarity and alignment, which is what this is, in terms of the solar system. Well, here's actually is this map. And this is just LEs 2 and 3, right? And I have turns out I have 6 extrema, okay? And that I should draw a great circle. That there's basically a great circle through their, turns out to be a great circle through their peaks, and it's perpendicular to the equinox approximately. And strangely, the equinox, it's not the equinox, the ecliptic nearly separates the strong ones in the south from these weak ones in the north, and that's another interesting thing. So is that an accident of the solar system? No one has figured out how you can possibly get the system, such systematics in both W map and Planck. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with the galaxy. It's really strange that it has anything to do with cosmology. So if you believe this is cosmological, and I do, then it's very strange. But it's also possible it has nothing to do with that, but unlikely. Okay, so these alignments are persistent. I mean, from map to map, doesn't matter what you do. No one's found any explanation for them in the instrument or in the solar system, but they're hard to explain. There's some others. One, which I think is extremely interesting and has gotten a lot of attention, and goes by several names: power asymmetry, dipole modulation, low northern variance. I tend to think of it in terms of this name, but probably this one is maybe the most common description of it. This is actually a theoretical phenomenological model to describe what's going on. What is going on? Well, if you look at this map, you might notice that there seems to be more going on down here than up here, right? And it's true. And that was first noticed by Bennett et al. In 2003. Unfortunately, that got cut off by Erickson et al. In 2004, and many, many others. There's been many, many characterizations of this. Some of them saying, oh, look, if we divide the sky into hemispheres, then there's a hemisphere down here that seems to have a lot more power than the hemisphere, than its opposite hemisphere. Okay? It's close to being the ecliptic great circle that separates them, but not exactly. Okay, so it may, it may or may not have something to do with the quadrupole octopole alignment, although statistically they have nothing to do with each other in lambda CDM. I like to think of it in terms of the fact that if I look at the variance of the temperature on a hemisphere and look at the south, here is the probability distribution that you would expect for hemispheres, a variance that you expect for hemispheres, and here sits the ecliptic south, completely normal. In fact, you might wonder, very normal, too normal. But anyway, very normal. And here sits the ecliptic north down here. So somehow the ecliptic north has almost no variance, and the ecliptic south is behaving completely normal. And it's why I resist the statement that this is dipole modulation. This doesn't look like a dipole. This looks like something funny is going on in the ecliptic north. This violation of statistical. Yeah.
If you do for the north and the south, do you get radically different results?
Well, the problem is that C of theta has big contributions for low L's.
Yes.
So it's hard to make a
but that's like dipole and some quadrupole. So
yeah,
throw those away and still ask the question.
Well, you can, except you could if the way that the universe got low C of theta
was
right
intimately connected.
Right. C, so if it was low C sub L giving you a low S half, you're right. But given that it's cancellation, you can't. Yeah. So this violation of statistical isotropy seems to extend to high L's. So you might have, everything I've told you so far was about low L's, right? People went and looked for this dipole modulation. That's what they were looking for in particular at high L's. And they don't find a statistically significant amplitude for the dipole when they fit it over in bands of like delta L of 100. But they still find, you can still find a dipole and ask, okay, if I find a dipole, what direction does it lie? Here they are. They're all clustered around the same direction, all the way out to about L of 1500. So is this surprising that if there was statistical isotropy violation, that you would have something like this where the amplitude becomes less significant and but you still see it, you still see this hint of it persisting to very high L. I think the answer is no, that this is not unreasonable, because I don't think that this is, that it's dipole modulation. Right? And the thing is, when you're, I mean, we found this ourselves, when we were looking at very low L of 2 and 3, you only have a few, you only have a few multiple vectors or ALMs to compare. But as you get higher and higher and higher in L, you have huge numbers of things that you're comparing. And so it's both very easy to, to be looking at tea leaves and find patterns, and also to miss patterns that are really there, that are organizing these ALMs. So if there's, I would expect that if this is real, that we're just using a very bad statistic to look for it. Right? That it's some much more complicated correlation of the ALMs that's really going on. And that just as at the the very lowest L, it's not really a dipole modulation. What it really is a low northern variance. Okay? That if we figured out the right theory for this violation of statistical isotropy, we'd see that it really does persist up to L of 1500 and maybe further. So, and there are a couple of other things that I think are important. We just had a brief sidebar about something called mirror parity, which is the fact that up to about L of 20, the odd L's have larger CLs than the even L's, which is very strange. I could talk about northern ecliptic polar excursions, which has to do with that first bite in the peak from that very first angular power spectrum I showed you. But what I hope I've convinced you is that there is a lot of several sigma evidence, pieces of independent several sigma evidence for the fact that either the universe is a likely realization of a statistically anisotropic cosmological model, or it is a very unlikely realization of a statistically isotropic cosmological model. So we've all assumed that we're living in a statistically isotropic cosmological model because that's what our theory told us. Okay? And because, our first glance at the universe says that, oh, that's a pretty good theory. Let's run with it. But we have all these pieces of evidence that our universe is not agreeing statistically with this theory, with this prediction of our theory that we should see evidence of statistical isotropy. Instead, we are seeing evidence of violation of statistical isotropy. So it is either a very fluky realization, or there's physics that we're missing. Okay. Now, with so many anomalies, what should we do? Well, we could try to write down a fundamental physical model and make testable predictions. That's the best. We could make reasonable phenomenological extrapolations and test them, and we can do that, and I'm happy to tell you more about those. We can test the fluke hypothesis and other lambda CDM, and all of that is subject for kind of another talk. So getting back to the audience I was talking to, people interested in primordial non-Gaussianity, violation of statistical isotropy does not imply or preclude non-Gaussianity, but it may make it much harder to measure, because all of our statistical results for non-Gaussianity assume statistical isotropy. So when you write down the bispectrum, you write it as a product of two terms, okay, in a way that can only be done if the universe is statistically isotropic. And then you go and construct estimators for FNL, various estimators, an optimal estimator, some diagonal covariance approximation for that. Those all assume that you can take the bispectrum and factor it in the statistically isotropic way. Okay? So if we can't do that, how would we even estimate FNL? Well, you might say, well, all I really care is I want to show that the bispectrum isn't zero, because that implies some non-Gaussianity. But that's not good enough, because knowing that zero isn't enough, you also have to know how big its variance is. Okay? And if you can't predict its variance because you no longer have your statistically isotropic model, how will you know if a non-zero value of your bispectrum is significant? Now, what I don't know, and I don't think anyone's really thought through, is what if the fact that we're seeing evidence of statistical isotropy is just a fluke? So what if we just live in a very strange realization? What does that mean for our predictions for the bispectrum, the 4-point function, the 6-point function? Right. So non-Gaussianity isn't just about the bispectrum. It's also features in the tail of the distribution of our independent variables, like the ALMs. But the tails of what distribution if the ALMs aren't the independent Gaussian random variables? So the best thing, as I said, is if we could find a fundamental physics model and make testable predictions. What do we need from such models? Well, here's a list of new fundamental physics models known to explain almost or so all or most or several of the anomalies. That's the list. There's nothing on it, okay, which is good. It means there's lots of work to do. Okay. The requirements are that it affects scales that were causally disconnected until recently, and it breaks statistical isotropy. Here is one that has potential for doing that because it meets those requirements that the universe has non-trivial topology. It's a stage for explaining multiple anomalies. And what I mean is we expect it to break statistical isotropy because these are no longer the scalar eigenmodes. We look at this and we're not surprised that the eigenmodes of the scalar wave operator are not statistically isotropic. These are example fundamental domains of the 6 compact orientable E3 Euclidean manifolds. Okay. So we don't expect to have that the ALMs are statistically independent Gaussian random variables. In fact, what we can solve the wave equation on these manifolds, and what it tells us is that Fourier modes with the same amplitude. Well, first of all, not all Fourier modes are eigenmodes. Second of all, no Fourier mode is typically an eigenmode in a typical one. Typically, what you have is pairs of eigenmodes with the same magnitude of their wave vector being correlated, perfectly correlated. That's just in the Euclidean space. So in the Euclidean space, the eigenmodes are finite linear combinations of Fourier modes, but discrete and with correlated amplitudes. But who knows? The universe may have a small non-zero curvature, in which case the story gets much more complicated. And I would argue that we shouldn't ignore that possibility. Here's an example of the fundamental domain of a particular S3 manifold. Here's one of a particular H3 manifold. So the real story is that topology breaks statistical homogeneity, and that all of the non-Gaussian statistical results assume statistical homogeneity, and that there's a lot of evidence that whether it's topology or not doing this, something is breaking the statistical homogeneity. And that is requires us to think through how this violation of statistical, I'm glossing over an important point. I just changed isotropy to homogeneity. Almost all manifolds are statistically inhomogeneous. What does that mean? Even though the metric that you put on them is homogeneous, the properties that you'll find as an observer vary depending on where you are. That there are certain exceptions that have caused us not to notice this. One exception is the covering spaces of all the manifolds. The one we think about most. The next exception is the simple 3 torus, which is where we do all of our, all of our simulations. So in those cases, and a couple of others, it turns out that no matter where you are, the statistical properties that you will measure, okay, that you will infer are homogeneous. They don't depend on your location. But in a typical manifold, they vary enormously from place to place. So not only do we break statistical isotropy, we also break statistical homogeneity. It's not surprising that the breaking of statistical isotropy goes along with the breaking of statistical homogeneity, because what you've really done is you've broken the isometry group of your covering space, which for the Euclidean space is translations and rotations. And it seems kind of unlikely that you just break the rotation part of it and not the translation part of it. And indeed, typically you break both. And all of the non-Gaussian statistical results assume statistical homogeneity. And I think you can take the non-Gaussian out of here and extend it to an awful lot of other things that we do. So our universe makes a very poor case for statistical isotropy. I think you assume it at your peril. And the question is, what do we do without it? Thanks.
Hey, great talk, even better in time. Have any question in the room or okay, got one from Zach.
Probably a lot of the instrument at 90 is impossible to track. This is a form of it's not crazy. You would get systematic orthogonal disk, no way, right? All the forces are in the disk. So if you see it in your like side lobe, it's going to show up at 9 degrees, right?
So I'm going for my answer. My following I'm going to say is, look, that question has obviously been asked for about 20 years to all sorts of people who knew exactly what you just said, right? In two very, very, very different experiments. And yet both of them agree surprisingly well on the maps, right? And on all of these statistics that have to do with the alignment. Right? And so no one has found a way in which the beams end up leaking in exactly this strange and mysterious way. And it's kind of also okay. So, but I think that's really that is that lots of clever people have tried to take that observation and turn it into an explanation of why you end up with a quadrupole and octupole that look like this. And I don't, and it's not that I don't think, I know no one has done so. Okay.
I would add.
Yeah. Go.
Dependence of these anomalous features, and obviously it's reproduced in both the WMAP blank, and some of them are reproduced in Kobe, in fact. And so, one of the big issues with saying, if we have an anomaly, is there any frequency dependence at all? And the answer, as far as we can tell, is not. And so that is pushes you into the direction of saying these are serious things on the sky and not associated with something which could have been a really big effect, which is that as you're going around, you're picking up the galaxy. That was even more so for WMAP than it was for Planck because of the nature of the differencing.
I have a question. There's one on the chat. Are there non-CMB measurements that show? Sorry. Are there non? Oh, I don't want to be unmuted there. I want to be unmuted there. Okay. Are there non-CMB measurements that show consistent effect.
Good. So you can ask, let me turn that around and ask, where else might we see the effects? If this is physics, not just a fluke, we wouldn't expect it to just be living on the last scattering surface, right? Oh, where do we go look? So we might try to look in large scale structure. Most of the signals so far in large scale structure is at angular correlations, so angular scales that are less than, which so far that maybe will change. We'll have reliable information at larger angular scales. So we don't have a good measurement of fluctuations on the scales where there's a strong signal in the CMB yet. Will that change? Maybe. Has anyone done a really good calculation that tells us what exact signal we would expect in a lambda CDM model in which we fix the CMB to temperature maps to be what we see? No. Are people going to try? I think we're going to try, but am I really optimistic about large scale structure as a way of seeing this? No. Okay, but it's worth looking for. Am I more optimistic about intensity mapping at redshifts that are that are moderately high? Yes. Certainly we would expect to see this at Z of 200 or 50 or 20. But Z of 2 large scale structure seems unlikely. So no one has seen this in non-CMB, any of these in non-CMB measurements. I think that's a fair. I think that's
The claim they have. So earlier than the CMB attack on the problem was the attempt to try and find correlated quasar pairs, one there and one there, and they would be the same thing associated with the photon trajectory and the topology. And so that was a very serious business for a while. No strong evidence, and the constraints within the class of models, but the constraints are that a scale of topology is sort of hovering around H0 inverse. So it's not something where you expect to see it on much smaller scales.
Okay, I think so. It's a two important question. Anisotropy from other probes. There may be evidence in E-mode correlation, E-mode polarization. Okay, there's claimed evidence in E-mode polarization of an absence of basically an S1/2 problem in E-mode polarization. I think it's not robust yet, but maybe it'll turn out to be right. Yeah. And we predicted this. It's interesting. We predicted that this would happen. That if you saw this in T, then you should see it in E because they're both coming from the scalar. Anyway, but then there's the question of how do we, are there other ways to look for topology other than CMB? And this whole what's called cosmic crystallography was a method is looking for objects, and there was a lot of work on that. And they did they ever have a claim that they saw something? Of course, anybody. Yeah. Right. I'm not sure anyone. I'm not sure they had a claim that was strong enough that people. Right. Now, it says really interesting, which I think we actually just put out a paper earlier this week, and we'll put out another one last week, and we'll put out another this week. That makes which is to be really careful with the limits that we, us, Dick, other people put on, Planck put on cosmic topology. So. There are two classes of limits that we put on cosmic topology. The first one is called, it comes from something called circles in the sky. And it's a statement that the shortest closed non-contractible loop around the universe through us has a length greater than the diameter of the last scattering surface. Actually, 98.5%. Okay. So that's the first one. And there's a very important pair of words in there, through us. Because remember, I told you that that topology violates statistical homogeneity. And it turns out that in most Euclidean manifolds, it is not the case that the fact that that through us can be generalized to everywhere. Most of them violate statistical homogeneity. And so in fact, I can show you very simple manifolds in which the fact that the shortest path through us is greater than the diameter of the last scattering surface tells us that the shortest path around the universe anywhere is greater than 1/6 of the diameter of the last scattering surface, which is a much weaker limit. Okay, so that's the first thing is that the universe may have topology scales that are considerably shorter than H0 inverse. The second type of limits were obtained by calculating the correlation function, right? The mode-mode correlation function, and comparing the mode-mode, seeing what correlation, which was better, the off-diagonal mode-mode correlation function you would get from a non-trivial topology, or the diagonal one you get from the covering space. And the answer was within the range of modes that were able to be examined, that there is no compelling evidence for non-trivial topology. The problem with that very, very difficult, very expensive search was that it turns out that people had not explored the full parameter space of the allowed topologies. Okay, so the simplest example is, if I take an ordinary 3 torus, typically we might build it out of a cube. Okay, we might say the universe is tiled by cubes, periodic boxes, and they have 3 lengths, L1, L2, and L3. And of course, we knew that L1 didn't have to be equal to L2, but it didn't have to be equal to L3. Okay? But most of the searches were done with L1, L2 equal L3. But no one noticed that the angles between these sides didn't have to be 90 degrees. Okay? And it turns out that when you do that, it completely changes the correlation matrix. Okay? And so what was searched was a small subset. Some of my colleagues want to use the statement, a set of measure 0 of the part of the parameter space in which we actually could find cosmic topology. And there were claims that once the last scattering surface was inside the fundamental domain, wholly contained within the fundamental domain, there wasn't enough information anyway in the CMB to extract the topology. And it turned out that that calculation that was done and published was correct for the particular case that they examined, which was a cubic topology. Okay? And it is not true as soon as you start tilting the angles, tilting the sides, and it is not true once you start rotating opposite faces when you make the identification of them. And it is not true what they thought was that all of the interesting information was in L less than or equal to about L max of around 30. It turns out that the correlation function has important off-diagonal terms out as far as we can measure them, right? And we can see for example, the KL divergence growing with L max. We've taken it out to 50. We've have other measures that take it out beyond that. So it appears, as you might have suspected from various arguments, that you have more information certainly all the way out to the first peak and probably beyond. And that will allow you, even in all sorts of simple cases, to certainly go to topology scales that are bigger than 1, maybe 2, maybe 3, maybe 6, depending on exactly what manifold you're looking at. So so the title of our paper last Thursday, our archive posting, was "The Search for Cosmic Topology Has Only Just Begun."
So I have one more. I did read that paper, and I recommend it to anybody who's interested because it's a great overview. So one thing that you didn't touch on here or in that paper that I'm curious about is whether there's any like theoretical basis for thinking a particular topology could be or should be, I don't know, based on string theory or something.
Let's see. I'd say if you firmly believe in most inflationary models, you'd say don't bother, go looking. Okay. So if you and that I don't place enough confidence in any quantum cosmology model to answer the rest of your question. So I don't think there's any convincing argument why one manifold would be better than another.
Just to
Yep.
amplify on that. A tricky thing, because the way we've all played the game is to say we have these inflationary fluctuations that are built upon this top structure, but it is pretty obvious that if you're going to build a structure of some scale, then it's going to have an impact on the CLs. It's just that the usual thing that's done is the highest degree of naivete we could have. There is an effect which Glenn was one of the champions of. It was that with some of these topologies, the kinds of trajectories become chaotic, which is not a bad scenario for trying to explain lack of correlation. I probably don't really have time to go into it, maybe over lunch or something. But there's still a lot to be thought about. So I like that new title. The game has just begun.
Right. And I think go across the road, not so far. I think I'm pointing the right direction, and go talk to Latham Boyle or his former boss Neil Turok, because they've been writing papers, about universes nucleating. They're highly homogeneous. And if you ask them, well, do you know, does this work just as well with non-trivial topologies? The answer is yes. I don't think they know any. I don't think they have any clear prediction about the size of universe that would come out of that. But so maybe the universe emerged homogeneous, with a homogeneous metric, very low level of fluctuations. And then you say, okay, well, let me reach into my bag of manifolds and pull one out. Which one do I pull out? And how do I even count? How do I put a proper measure on this space in which, this manifold, what's called E1, has 6 real degrees of freedom, right? But there's only 18 Euclidean manifolds, and they each have up to, so less than or equal to 6 real degrees of freedom. But then there's a countable infinity of hyperbolic manifolds and of S3 manifolds, right? Which may or may not have real degrees of freedom other than the curvature scale. They certainly have the curvature scale. I think people have been wrong in thinking they don't have other degrees of freedom, at least the spherical manifolds. But so there's a whole space out there that's going to be really hard to. I think if anything, we've learned anything from theoretical physics over the last 50 years is it's really hard to get your theory right when you don't have any data. So.
Okay. I don't think we have any more questions in the room, so let's thank Glenn one more time.